Tilea's Troubles, Part 44. The First to Leave. Prequel to What Happened Outside Astiano, a Battle Report. Trantio, Early Autumn, 2402. On almost any other occasion, what they were doing would be considered reckless, culpably so, to ride so fast, even at a gallop, through the city, especially when the streets were at their most crowded. But they had orders from the Duke himself specifying haste, and they would not wish to disappoint their employer. With the Duke's own officers observing their passage, a leisurely ride would not do. They had a reputation to maintain. Besides, it was fun. Today the streets were busier than usual, jammed with every cart, coach and wagon the city possessed, as well as all those that could be taken from the surrounding farms and villages, along with the mules, oxen, donkeys and asses. All were to be loaded with goods and possessions, and if not already packed, then they were piled around with goods yet to be hefted. More and more was being dragged from the houses and shops by every two-legged servant the city-state had to offer. As Gilvas and his comrades clattered along, their mounts' hoofs throwing up sparks from the stones, the cluttered narrowness of the way meant umpteen citizens were forced to throw themselves against walls, dodge hastily into doorways, or even duck beneath their wagons. Whereas normally they might gasp and gawp at such riders, what with elves being a rarity on any Tilean street, certainly armoured elves upon snow-white horses. Now, however, there was little time for such curiosity. The pressing need to avoid being trampled was foremost in most people's minds. It was a shame, thought Gilvas, for he knew his company was a sight to behold, finer than any gaudily bedecked Tilean knight, sweating and grunting beneath ornate heavy plate, more skilful and nimble than even the very best of human horsemen. Mercenary Sharlian Riders favoured green for cloaks and shirts, and their scaled coats and horsebarding were lacquered to match. Although the rest of their garb and trappings were of more muted, natural hues, the flawlessly white hides and manes of their mighty mounts gave them a brightness that more than matched any red, blue or purple surcoat and shield. Gilvas held his finely carved lance aloft, and, like his companions, had eyes suitably keen and wits sufficiently quick to ensure he always dipped it just in time whenever he rode beneath a laundry line or a balcony. The only thing marking him out from the other riders was that he wore a hood, a habit that had brought laughter from his blonde-haired companions the day they realised he did so because of his black hair. As Fran had pointed out, it was a dilemma, for to hide that which made him different, he had to make himself look different. To which Reuven riposted, it was only a dilemma because Gilvas refused to wear a yellow periwig. Gilvas noticed several onlookers frowning or scowling as his company rode by. He doubted this was because their thundering passage was troublesome, or merely that they were elves, nor even due to them serving Trantio's recent conqueror, Duke Guidobaldo of Pavona. No, it was surely because their unusually rapid progress gave the distinct impression that they were attempting to escape the city before everyone else. He couldn't help smiling at the thought, for it was partly true. They were indeed leaving. Although it was not an escape, it was obedience. While everyone else was to travel south to find refuge in Astiano, the Sharlian Riders were to travel north, carrying orders to the Duke's son, Lord Silvano, after which they were to join him as reinforcements for his own little force in the service of the Holy Army of Moor. As they rounded a bend in the street onto the stretch that led to the Ponte Grande and the city's eastern gate, Reuven, riding a little behind Gilvas, shouted to him, "Have a care, Gilvas! Those mules can give a nasty kick!" Nearly all Reuven's utterances were jests, which before battle could be a welcome thing, and was thoroughly entertaining when carousing in a tavern. The rest of the time, it could be bothersome to have to weigh each comment to determine whether it was based on some truth or merely a humorous fancy. When he glanced at the mules in question, he could see they were pulling away from the galloping horses. No threat at all. Then something upon the other side of the street caught Gilvas's eye. Two children, hurtling down an alley, now stumbling and halting in surprise at the sight before them. Ragamuffin boys come to see the Fey Riders, their eyes wide and their heads filled with whatever nonsense some uncle or grandfather had told them concerning elf-kind. Better they consider what they have heard about ogres, thought Gilvas, and be about packing or carrying or whatever else their mothers and masters had told them to do. He himself knew that ogres were always hungry brutes, who might well see such children as nothing more than morsels of meat. He felt a pang of guilt, then sorrow, but it was soon diminished when he reminded himself that the population was leaving, and so the boy stood at least a chance of surviving. A little ahead of Gilvas, outpaced only by the company's pennant-bearer, was Captain Presre, upon his unicorn. It was that beast that drew the most stares, and was probably responsible for the two boys' sudden awe. Humans will fall for almost anything, thought Gilvas, if the subterfuge is subtle, the legerdemain apparently legitimate. And not just children, but full-grown men too. Only the youngest elves would look at the captain's mount and think it anything other than a wild-maned stallion sporting a false horn of oversized proportions. Amongst men, however, it was an easy deception. "You can look, but do not approach too close," Captain Presre would say. "Moondown is proud and fierce, allowing only a few to touch him." One young reman had spent more than 3 weeks in the painting of the horse and sold the likeness for a considerable sum, paying the agreed proportion to Presre, of course. Not once had the captain divulged his secret or let slip the slightest remark to give the game away. Only his own men knew the truth, as well as how to mix the necessary glue so well that not once had the huge horn dislodged itself. Even now, Presrai rode Moondown in all apparent earnestness, needing no saddle, nor harness, nor bridle, like some legendary hero. It was an act that paid dividends. How many other mercenaries in Tilea had lords tumbling over each other to contract them? Duke Guidobaldo himself was so taken by Moondown and the rest of the company that he paid ridiculously well to hire them, as well as recompensing the Archlector the full amount in gold which he had originally paid to hire them. The Sharlian Riders had come to Trantio merely to escort a priestly emissary with complaints about the War of the Princes, and then they were supposed to return to Remus. But who says no when a duke offers to pay twice for you?
"There's our noble commander that was,"
shouted Reuven, pointing towards the wizard Belastra, acting governor of Trantio.
"I still say we are not the strange ones here."
"We'll have real Tilean nobility ordering us soon enough," said Gilvas.
"True, although 'twould be better if it were a man and not a boy."
Belastra had an armoured guard by him, bearing a plume that showed him to be a Pavonan state army captain. He himself carried a wooden staff and wore loose robes of a somewhat Arabian fashion. Unusually for a wizard, he had become lieutenant governor of the city while the new Gonfaloniere for life, Lord Silvano, was away. Perhaps he had relished the prospect of ruling an entire city-state, thought Gilvas. If so, then receiving Duke Guidobaldo's orders to strip the city bare of all wealth, supplies, livestock and people, and flee, must have come as quite the disappointment to him. Still, as he had to do it all so quickly, before the ogres arrived, it was unlikely he had had much time to brood over the vagaries of fortune. The Pavonan Duke wanted to deny the ogres what they most desired: pillaging and looting, cruel sports and tortures, feasting and drinking. It so happened that in the process he had also denied Belastra whatever sports, cruel or otherwise, he himself had been looking forward to. Of course there was no scowl from the wizard as they passed. He knew exactly where the riders were going, and why, for it was him who had passed on the orders. Instead, there was something else writ in his expression, neither trepidation or fear. Gilvas found it hard to be certain, however, for human faces were not easy to read, twisted as they were so often into grotesque distortions of a kind rarely employed by elves. It was most likely to be fear, he decided, for the Sharlian Riders would have made a vast difference to the martial escort of such a train as was about to leave Trantio. There were very few, if any, could compare to them for outriders and scouts. And as horse soldiers they packed a lot more punch than any Border Prince's Stradiot or Estalian Ginette, whilst outmanoeuvring any Tilean mounted man-at-arms with ease, none of which, it so happened, were available to Belastra. Soon to command a city-sized rabble of refugees, Belastra must surely have regretted having to send the elves away. Just beyond the wizard was a bunch of mercenary crossbowmen, perhaps acting as his guards during such troubled times. It was no easy thing to make the entire populace of a city the size of Trantio abandon their homes and livelihoods. Although some were willing enough, for fear of what was coming, Many believed it would be better to defend the city, and of those a significant number went beyond thinking, to voicing their opinion, shouting their disagreement, perhaps even swinging a fist to make their point somewhat more forcefully. No surprise, then, to find the man tasked with ensuring their obedience so guarded. The crossbowmen were the last surviving fragment of the once large Tilean Compagnia del Sole mercenary company. Their comrades had all either perished during the War of the Princes or afterwards, during the furore over the death of a priestly ambassador carrying important letters from the Archlector requiring immediate cessation of that war. These men, one of two large companies of crossbowmen who had been defending Trantio's walls, had somehow negotiated the tricky path from being enemies to allies. In fact, they had done so successfully that they had now been paid twice. Reuven had laughed for an hour after seeing Captain Presrai's face upon hearing the news. The Sharlian Riders had similarly been paid for twice, but they themselves received only one of the payments, the other going to the Archlector, their previous employer, as compensation for his loss. The crossbowmen, formerly enemies of Pavona, and hated ones at that, had received both payments. The first to contract them as a standing force for the city, serving to guard the Duke's newly won realm from both unrest within and enemies without. The second, only a few months later, when their contract was renegotiated entirely to make them a part of the Pavonan marching army. For half an hour, Reuven's merriment derived from his description of the captain's immediate reaction to the news. Then for the next half hour, it was fuelled by his lyrical exploration of Presrai's subsequent thoughts as he wondered how he might do the same. Only Reuven could turn several moments' silent expression into a tumbling, comedic wordplay lasting an hour. One of the crossbowmen's sergeants stood upon the flank, gesturing towards the riders with a quarrel. Perhaps he too, thought Gilvas, was waxing lyrical about the very same topic. What else do such mercenaries concern themselves with, if not money? Maybe wine and wenches, but foremost comes money, for it is that which makes the wine more accessible and better, and the women more amenable and better. It was with that thought in mind that he glanced to the other side of the street and saw 3 Trantian maids watching from the doorway of a mean-looking house. One glance, and he knew they were exactly the type known to the crossbowmen. One stood in front, hands on hips, yellow bodice pulled tight, a wry smile on her face as if she knew what amused her. The others were clutching ducks, which made Gilvas smile. The people of Trantio were even taking their poultry with them. If the ogres did not hurry, they would find not one tiny morsel of flesh, fish or fowl, not one egg, olive, nor even a grain of wheat remaining. And that would hurt, what with them having the sort of appetite that took whole hogs to satisfy, and a thirst requiring gallons of wine and not just a few cups. It almost made him feel sorry for the ogres. Then he spotted a grey priest lurking close to the wenches, an ugly sort of man, although there were few men that elves did not think in some way disagreeable in appearance, with a tonsured pate and garbed in a coarse woollen cassock and sandals. Gilvas was not surprised. One could go nowhere in Trantio these days without meeting a Morite cleric or four. Luckily, for him and his comrades, the priest had no desire to preach to elves. He had already learned that Remus was an overly pious sort of place, swarming with devout followers of Mor wailing about the dead. But then he discovered the Pavonans had their own kind of Morite faith, claiming it to be the most perfect form, which was even more onerous. The Pavonan Morites demanded that one's every thought must be pure, not simply one's actions, and that each failing in this regard required some sacrifice or penance. What with Trantio having been, according to Pavonan propaganda, under the rule of a cruel and tainted tyrant prince, then as soon as the soldiers had captured it, a swarm of lesser Morite clergy followed to begin the work of admonishing, instructing, correcting. The Trantians had not exactly been overjoyed at this holier-than-thou guidance, and right now they must be wondering why they put up with it at all, if they were going to lose all they had anyway. Such disgruntlement probably explained why the priest skulking in the alleyway had a Pavonan handgunner by his side.
"Think of your death, Gilvas!" shouted Reuven. "There's a jolly priest watching us!"
Gilvas could not help but laugh, for only the night before Reuven had regaled the company with a cruelly rhetorical discourse, comparing how the Riemann priests of Mor had marched north to face the armies of walking dead in battle, while their brethren, these Pavonan clergy, battled bravely each and every day to teach the Trantians how not to slur the words of their prayers, and the proper penance for picking their noses. Still, thought Gilvas, it mattered not whether the people resented their reformation or were happy with their new lords. If they wanted to live, then they had to leave as ordered. Whether they would all go where they'd been told to, carrying burdens for their Pavonan conquerors and mercenary guards, remained yet to be seen. At the head of the company flew their pennant of green silk, bearing a white branch. Towards the gate and bridge beyond they rode, and what with the waggons already queuing there, it was going to be perilous for both elves and men if they kept their present pace. As he approached the crowded portal leading to the ancient highway, Gilvas glanced at the city walls. He wondered if Balastra would burn the city, for if he was so thoroughly removing everything else, why leave the ogres any shelter? What with the destruction wrought by vampires and ogres, and now the Tileans raising their own settlements, it seemed possible that the whole northern half of the peninsula would soon be in ruins. It was not the happiest of thoughts to have when setting out to ride further north.